I have a deep-seated infatuation for irony, sarcasm, condescension, that sort of stuff, and I find American history filled with ironies. I'm not a history buff. I'm not into American history. I'm not into politics. But I find there's a there's so many historical um, ironies, situational irony, because there's a clear distinction between dramatic, situational, tragic, verbal, and Socratic slash um, um, s- um, Socrates irony, right? And you could see where historically in American history where the ironies are broken up into subset increments, century by century. If we proceed back to 1756, the 7 Year War between the British and the French. Remember that war between 1756 to 1763, right? The war over imperialism was a war over colonies. And remember, the British and the French shared the land in North America, right? But then the British Empire was growing. And you remember in those days, it is all about industrial superiority. And that's what kind of spawned the war, a rivalry over land. Primarily natural resources. It's not about so much land, it's more about natural resources. Because after the British won the war with the French, they gave the French a few islands down the archipelago in Central and South America, where you could say somewhere in the West Indies, where it had sugar because the British had sugar in North America. So you see, there's a clear extension where the war is more about resources rather than land. But anyway, after they were victorious, right? After they were victorious, the British went bankrupt, right? They ran out of money because they infused all this funds for war, and now they needed money, so they started imposing taxes on the colonies. And this is where the American colonies revolted because they felt like if we're going to pay taxes, we need to have a representative in the parliament. And in the American colonies, there were no representative. So it spawned a revolution. There's more detailed stuff in it. I'm just scraping the mere surface. I'm just scraping the surface to give an introduction as to just to get to the ironic scenario. Because then you had the Boston Tea Party, where the Boston colonies, where they got on the British boat, they dispersed of all the tea, and then you had and then you have where the British imposed all these acts on the American colonies, the Sugar Act. They had a few acts they imposed on them. But what spawned the revolution was the colonies wanted their own liberty, and they didn't like how Britain was imposing all these rules and capitalistic. But here's the irony. The irony is the British King George III won the states. He won the colonies, but then the American colonies created a revolution and they won this. That's an irony. That's an irony. You fought all that war to win the colonies and then you lose it in a revolution. That's one situational irony. Let's fast forward to another situation. Oh, Article of Confederation. Article of Confederation was the first United States Constitution. It was drafted, right, a year after the Declaration of Independence. Okay, the second irony was in the Declaration of Independence, when we said we hold this. I can't verbatim this. I'm going to have to paraphrase it to the best of my ability. We hold that all men are created equal. Um, um, Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness unalienable, right? That's hypocrisy because blacks were freaking in chains and bonds. African Americans were in cages, right? American Indians were being slaughtered. And women wasn't allowed the right to freaking vote. African Americans didn't come here. When the British were colonizing the freaking world, they went to Africa in the 1400s and they started bringing Africans from South America on the transatlantic slave trade. There was like a triangle in the Atlantic when you look at it. They used to disperse 40% to North America, and then they disperse a whole 60% to South America, which is Brazil. That's why Brazil have the second largest black population in the world. And then they used to disperse them throughout the Caribbean, sprinkle them. That's why all these islands have all these blacks, Africans technically. And there's a major cultural dichotomy in the West Indies, right? They appear to share a common denominator, but it's very exclusive culturally. So let's fast forward here. That's an irony, the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. But remember, Africans in those days were seen as subhumans. So that's an irony. The Article of Confederation is also an American historical irony. Because when the Article of Confederation was drafted in 1777, right? They had issues with it because the Article of Confederation did not have an executive branch. It did not have a judicial system, and the federal slash national government, whichever one, because these two, the federal government and national government, they're synonymous, you know. There's a little distinction, but they're always used interchangeably and out of context. But during that time, the federal government could not impose taxes, right? Interstate trading interstate commerce could not be imposed by the federal government. So they had an issue with this because all these colonies still had their their sovereignty, right? They started printing their own money. So what the government decided to do was, right, put together and draft the United States Constitution, right? Which was drafted, I think, in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania in 1789. When they drafted the Constitution in 1789, quite a number of states opposed the, signing the treaty because they felt like the United States Constitution facilitated the needs of the federal government more. It gave the government too much power, and to avoid tyranny and despotism against civil rights and human liberty, right? States were huge proponents of them implementing an idea or concept called the 10 Bill of Rights, which not just facilitated the federal government, but it also gives states a certain level of sovereignty. Right? Right? So the Bill of Rights was implemented in the Constitution. It was the U.S. Constitution was drafted in 1789. It was amended in 1780. The U.S. Wait! Put your thoughts together, man! The U.S. Constitution was drafted in 1787. It was amended in 1788, and it was ratified in 1789. And the Bill of Rights was implemented in 1789. New York and Virginia was the last two states to sign that treaty and become part of it. It was called then the Union. Right? That's a kind of ironic situation where the first Article of Confederation facilitated all sovereign states and gave the federal government little power, and they had to redraft it with a contrasting perspective. That's why you find America is considered more of a republic, because although the United States have its own constitution, each state have its own level of sovereignty. They have their own statute and their own code of statute. Have you ever noticed that each state have its own United States Constitution? That's why one state could legalize homosexuality, another state could legalize marijuana for medical uses, another state could legalize marijuana for recreational purposes, because there's a level of sovereignty involved, where the power is allotted not just through the federal but also state government. So you see a kind of particular irony there. Let's fast forward now. I'm telling you, I'm not into American history now. I find the ironies intriguing. Let's fast forward to the Civil War, when the 16th president Abraham Lincoln he became president in 1861. He was inaugurated in 1860. He became president in 1860. Come on, man, put your thoughts together. He was inaugurated in 1861. Right, the Civil War was between 1861 to 1864. 1, 2, 3, 4. It was a 4-year war between the North and the South. Here's the irony: the South. What caused the Civil War was not only that Abraham Lincoln's objective was to abolish slavery. The South seceded from the Union, and they created what was called the Confederate, because the South wanted to have their own sovereign state, because the North, right, was more industrial, more advanced. But the South seceded from the Union because their economy was contingent on agriculture, so they needed slaves, right? And half of the 40 to 50% of the cotton from the South was provided for the British. That's kind of ironic, right? But here's the problem: when the South seceded from the Union, South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union. That spawned the Civil War, because Lincoln wanted all the states to be under this federal jurisdiction. So the war started, and then the South was seeking assistance from the British to help them in the war. But the British didn't recognize the South as a country. They recognized a bunch of allotted sovereign states. But what's intriguing about the British was slavery was already abolished in 1808, 1807 to be exact, by the British. That's ironic. They were the biggest advocates, the biggest pioneers, the biggest proponents of freaking imperialism, colonialism, and slavery, and they abolished slavery in 1807 to be exact, right? How many years before slavery was abolished in the United States in 1865? You see the irony? So you're trying to sell cotton, right, to a place that abolished slavery in 1808, and you still proponent of slavery. That's an irony. Another irony is you seeking assistance from British. These were the same people that you had a revolution with King George III to fight for revolution. This is how the Declaration of Independence in 1770 and you're seeking help from them to fight the North. That is irony. The South could not sell cotton to Britain because Britain abolished slavery and they were more industrialized, so they moved on. Right? So it was a long 4-year war. Eventually the South lost the war and they ended up becoming part of the Union. Slavery was abolished in 1865. But guess what? That's another irony. It was abolished, but that's when African Americans' life became miserable, because that was the spawn of the KKK. Because when slavery was abolished, the South was pissed. Well, what do we do now? Who's gonna freaking pick the cotton and plant the corn? Anyway, I don't want to turn this into humor, This is a serious matter, man. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, Abraham Lincoln was president in 1860. He became inaugurated in 1861. The 4-year war was 1861 to 1864. 1, 2, 3, 4. Slavery was abolished in 1865. Right? Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865 in a freaking movie theater. He was watching and when there was a gigantic applause, someone came up behind him and shot him in the back of his head. Ba ba ba! Rode off in a chariot. You see those movies with chariots and horses. It's true, right? But what's intriguing was the 13th Amendment was implemented in the Constitution in 1865, 1866 to be exact, which abolishes slavery. The irony here, that was the introduction to hate and racism. All the real murder, mass killing, and lynching started after that, You all see the irony? The 14th Amendment was implemented in 1868, which grants citizenship, right, to minorities. African people were given the right. And the 15th Amendment, right, was give minorities again, or slaves, the right to vote, right? So, but here's the irony between the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment implemented in 1865, 1866 to be exact, 1868 and 1870. Let's fast forward to point out a huge irony. In 1909, the NAACP, which is abbreviated term for the National Association for Advanced Colored People, which was spawned in 1909. Rosa Parks, you know who Rosa Parks was. She was part of this organization, and she was the one who refused to get off the bus. That was actually that really kind of spark, right? It brought the civil rights movement straight. It's pinnacle. That really sparked the civil rights movement, big time, right? But here's the big irony. Remember I told you about the 15 amendments would give people the right to vote, right? In 1963, Kennedy, right, got assassinated while he was trying to ratify the Civil Rights Act. Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act was enacted in 1964 by Lyndon. When John F. Kennedy was assassinated, the acting president at the time, I think, was John Lyndon. I forgot his name, man. Right? He was the one who came after, and he was living the legacy of Kennedy by being a huge proponent and advocate of ratifying the Civil Rights Act. It was eventually ratified in 1964. Then you had the Voting Rights Act that came just like a chain tandem of act. Civil Rights Act in 1964, the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and the Fair Housing Act in 1968, right, which divorced the discrimination against age, race, color, nationality, blah, blah, blah. So you have 1964, the Civil Rights Act, 1965, the Voting Rights Act, and 1968, the Fair Housing Act. How you can have the Voting Rights Act in 1965, right? When in 1870, the Voting Rights Act was implemented in the Constitution. You all see another big irony, right? Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. Malcolm X got assassinated in 1965, right around the Voting Rights Act. Just after the Civil Rights Act, he got assassinated. Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968 around the Fair Housing Act, right? They all got assassinated between all the acts, right? But there's a lot of irony. There's a lot of irony in American history. A lot of irony, When the British won the war with France, they signed something called the Treaty of Paris. It was signed in Paris, an agreement between France and Britain to never